The next item of business is a statement by Jenny Gilruth on initial response to the Gillis Review of University of Dundee Finances. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary up to 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, Scotland's universities are anchor institutions in our communities, acting both locally and globally. Put simply, they are woven into the very fabric of Scotland's identity. Before I turn to the substantive matters of today's statement, I want to acknowledge the deep concern, uncertainty and distress that many of the staff, students and wider community of the University of Dundee have felt in recent months. I have witnessed this at first hand, having engaged with trade unions directly over recent months and having met with staff at the University School of Life Sciences. At the heart of Dundee University is a community who care deeply about the future of the institution. My focus, the focus of this government, is on ensuring that the University of Dundee emerges from this crisis stronger than ever. Before we can move forward to secure that future, the university must respond to the urgent and clear conclusions of Professor Pamela Gillies' reports on financial oversight and decision-making. We've already seen individuals at the university take decisive action, with changes at a senior level being announced last week. Now, this is welcome, and it must be the start of a process to not just appoint fresh leadership, but also to restore confidence amongst staff. I am encouraged that Professor Nigel Seaton, formerly Principal of Abertay University, will take on the role of Interim Principal on a short-term basis. Ian Mayer, who is Deputy Chair of Court, will step in as Interim Chair of Court, whilst elections, quite rightly, take place for a new Chair of Court over the summer. I also want to put on record my gratitude to the wider sector and to University Scotland for their collaborative efforts in supporting the University of Dundee. Turning to the Gillies Review itself, I want to sincerely thank Professor Pamela Gillies and her investigation team for the robust report which has been produced. I thank everyone who gave evidence to that review, and I extend my gratitude for a thorough and insightful report which has uncovered the events leading to this situation. Indeed, there is much detail in the report alongside important recommendations for the university to consider. The overall themes include a breakdown in governance and processes at a leadership and court level, as well as a culture which did not cultivate openness and challenge. Issues with financial management, reporting and oversight, missed opportunities that could have been taken earlier to raise and respond to a worsening financial situation. Now, Professor Gillies outlines that whilst the Scottish Funding Council's financial memorandum and Code of Good Higher Education Governance in Scotland are fit for purpose, and the university was obliged to comply, it did not. The Code provides a framework for effective management and governance arrangements, but the university failed to operate effectively in practice. Professor Gillies notes that there were inconsistencies and gaps in the information reported to the university's Executive Group, Finance Committee and to Court. But there was information produced which, with appropriate challenge, should have signalled warnings from March 2024, if not earlier. Whilst many of the recommendations are, quite rightly, a matter for Dundee University to respond to, ministers have already held early discussions with the Scottish Funding Council to consider what more we might seek to do to strengthen governance in our institutions. And it is right that we do this, given the public interest in our universities. With that in mind, I want to turn to the actions of the Scottish Government that we are taking to support the university at this difficult time. And let me be clear, this is not about rewarding failure. This is about responding to an unprecedented and a unique situation which threatens much of what we hold dear in our university sector. Students' futures, Dundee University's contribution to health and other sectors, the vitality of our communities and the profound impact that the university has on the wider city region. My colleagues will recall the announcement earlier this year of £25 million from the Scottish Government to the sector, of which £22 million was directed by the Scottish Funding Council to the University of Dundee. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is determined to do everything that we can to secure a positive future for Dundee University. That must be achieved through delivery of a sustainable, long-term recovery plan, which will see public financial support work alongside commercial and private investment to ultimately see reliance on extraordinary public funding ending. To that end, Ministers are keen to see progress at pace from the University to deliver that plan. We will accordingly develop appropriate conditions for the funding, working closely with the SFC, and only when that plan is in place will funding be released. The University's journey towards immediate and longer-term sustainability will continue to be supported by the ongoing work of the Strategic Advisory Task Force, chaired by Sir Alan Langlands. The task force is expected to complete its work in July. Presiding Officer, members understand that our universities are independent and autonomous institutions. In normal circumstances, decisions on the allocation of funding to individual institutions are quite rightly the responsibility of the Scottish Funding Council. However, this is a unique and an unprecedented set of circumstances which require a unique and an unprecedented response. Where there has been the appearance of financial mismanagement at an institution, Scottish ministers are obliged to consider whether it is necessary or expedient to issue a direction to the SFC about the provision of financial support. And subject to the public value test I have set out today, Scottish ministers consider it is both necessary and expedient for a direction to be issued to the SFC under Section 25 of the Further and Higher Education Scotland Act 2005. The use of this power is unprecedented and has been made necessary by the exceptional circumstances at the University, as set out in the findings of the Gillies report, which recount poor financial judgment and weak governance. The process as set out does, however, allow for ministers to target a direct settlement to the University of Dundee and to place specific conditions on that funding in this unprecedented set of circumstances. I can therefore confirm that the Scottish Government will provide funding in principle of up to £40 million over 2 academic years or 3 financial years via the Scottish Funding Council to support the University of Dundee. This funding is subject to further due diligence prior to any expenditure occurring. The SFC will continue to support the University in their development of a robust and deliverable recovery plan which leverages commercial lending. There remains, however, a liquidity gap. Dundee University estimate that gap to be in the region of between £45 million up to £68 million across the next 2 academic years. And this figure is also likely to be impacted by progress at the University to reduce expenditure and to stabilise their income. Now, colleagues will understand that this figure requires to be further interrogated by the Scottish Funding Council. The SFC has been advised by Dundee University that, whilst this is not an immediate cash need, it will need to be addressed before the end of this financial year. It is therefore vitally important that the University works to secure a plan which will allow for commercial lending to support some or all of that liquidity ask. The Government will, of course, consider all avenues and other support we can provide to achieve that end. Presiding Officer, I do want to provide reassurance to the wider higher education sector today that the additional funding to Dundee University will not impact on the funding available from the SFC to any other institution. And in doing so, I recognise that many institutions have worked proactively in response to a challenging operating environment over recent years to rationalise their operations, including on staffing levels. But there is a need for a reflection from our universities on the levels of growth that we witnessed in some institutions, particularly during the pandemic. Some of the planned job losses being experienced at the current time relate directly to that uncapped expansion. The costs being paid today are the unsustainable jobs created as a result. And whilst Dundee's finances may be unique, their approach to investment in the international student economy is not. There is therefore a lesson in the experiences at Dundee University, which other institutions should be mindful of. Presiding Officer, clearly Dundee University will need time to fully work through the challenges presented by the Gillies Review and to respond accordingly. Ministers will support that endeavour via the auspices of the Scottish Funding Council. The SFC will provide an update to the Education, Children and Young People Committee on its associated next steps. Ministers will provide a further update to Parliament early in the new term. I have appreciated the cross-party engagement with local members, and I give colleagues an undertaking today that engagement will continue as we progress with the associated next steps. Finally, I want to place on the record my personal thanks to the trade union representatives at Dundee University. Your leadership and your support to your members at this time has been invaluable. Presiding Officer, A line must now be drawn under mistakes made by a collective few, and we must jointly, across this chamber, endeavour to support Dundee University to rebuild, to thrive and to once again flourish. The City of Discovery should expect no less. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement, and also to put on record my concern for staff and students at this time at Dundee University, and at a time when universities across Scotland are experiencing serious concerns around their future financial sustainability. I do not think it is wise for us to say that we want to just draw a line under the mistakes made at Dundee University. And looking at the statement today, which the Cabinet Secretary has outlined, even after the steps the Government have taken, there is a potential £20 million black hole in the finances of Dundee University over the next 2 years. So can I ask specifically, what would Plan B be for the Government to help fund that gap, if that does happen, if we do see that £20 million being needed as a bailout over the course of the next 2 years? And given the allegations made by Wendy Alexander at the weekend, what potential police investigation has been taking place into criminality at the university?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Briggs for his question, and I share his concern for staff and for students. Mr Briggs mentioned a number of factors, Presiding Officer. I'm conscious that we are tight for time today. I want to try to address each in turn. In terms of the wider external factors, I've not touched on those explicitly today, but no doubt there are factors in relation to the changes to the international immigration rules that were introduced, of course, by Mr Briggs' party that have hampered our institutions. We know that was a factor in Dundee that is set out in Pamela Gillies' report. Brexit has also been a factor for Dundee. Again, that's a factor addressed in the report. Mr Briggs talks about drawing a line. That's not the Government's position at all. And if Mr Briggs considers the totality of recommendations, those are, in the main, quite rightly a matter for Dundee University. But I have been clear today that ministers want to assure ourselves around about approaches to governance. Mr Day and I met with the Chair of the Scottish Funding Council only yesterday, who was very clear that had the university adhered to the good practice guide that exists for all higher education institutions in Scotland, there would not have been an issue. And as I identified in my statement, that is not what happened. But we do want to assure ourselves of what more we might be able to do to strengthen governance in that respect. Mr Briggs has identified a figure that I am not familiar with in relation to the £20 million funding gap. The funding I have announced today is the totality of the ask from the university today. That has been met. I would also add to that, Presiding Officer, the £25 million we made available to the sector, of which £22 million was directed to Dundee earlier this year, and we will continue to work with the university. Finally, on the ask around about the next steps, that quite rightly, the Plan B is a matter for the university. However, the Scottish Funding Council are working to support the university. They need to come forward now with that long-term strategic plan for the university to allow it to thrive into the future. And apologies, Presiding Officer, there was a final point in relation to potential criminality. I believe I did address this in interviews last week, and I have heard some of the challenge from Wendy Alexander around about the culture in the organisation, which of course is also spoken to in the report itself. I have been assured by the Scottish Funding Council and by Professor Pamela Gillies that they have not found evidence of criminality. However, of course, that would be a matter for the appropriate authorities and not for ministers to comment on.
Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank Professor Gillies for her report that does lay bare the financial vandalism of 3 individuals in particular. There's real relief in Dundee, I would say, that there's now a greater understanding and acknowledgement of the conduct of management and the collapse of effective governance at the university. We all have to focus on building a sustainable future for the city's most important institution. So the university submitted that request for a further £100 million to the Scottish Government on 30th of May, 25 days ago. Can the Cabinet Secretary perhaps set out to us what additional scrutiny of that request is required almost 1 month on from that request? And the Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged in her statement that income growth from international recruitment is not a realistic option for Scottish universities. So where is the university going to find the money to repay up to £60 million of loans, whether it be from the government or from a commercial source? The Scottish Government has already given the green light for 300 job cuts, but without income growth, will that not make further cost cutting inevitable? How does the Cabinet Secretary think that that circle can be squared?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Barra for his question. He raises a number of points. First of all, he mentions the relief being felt in Dundee University. I think that was palpable on the first, of course, announcement from the Government around about funding. I met with staff on that very day earlier this year, and I've heard since from some of the trade union members in relation to their feeling on the back of the report publishing last week. So there is a palpable sense of relief, and I very much felt that frustration throughout the engagement that Mr Day and I have had with them. He's right to talk about a sustainable future. He spoke about the liquidity ask, I think, in the context of what I have announced today. And, of course, what I've set out is that the £40 million that has been requested is going to be met over the next financial years. That has been confirmed from Scottish Government. We do require to undertake further due diligence with the university. That will be undertaken at pace with the Scottish Funding Council. Mr Mara should also be mindful that, of course, the outcome of the report, which only published on Thursday, did impact on the way that ministers were able to award the funding I'm talking to today. So that use of the Section 25 is unprecedented. It required us to reflect on the unique situation existing in Dundee, but we will continue to work with the leadership at the university on next steps. I did, though, in my statement today, quite rightly talk to the need for additional extra funding to come from other sources that are not public, for example, via the banks, via commercial opportunities. Mr Mara will be aware of some of the challenges the university has faced in that regard that are spelled out in the report in relation to the lending facility of the university. And, of course, had that been an available financial option to the university today, they would not have found themselves in such a challenging position. But we will continue to work with Dundee University to support that growth, which is so vital for the institution, for the city and for the wider city region.
Joe Fitzpatrick, to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the announcement of support from the Cabinet Secretary and her decision to use the Section 25 power. I also appreciate how much ministers have been engaging with me and with other MSPs who have worked largely on a collaborative basis across party lines. My focus remains with staff who have been badly let down by the university's management and remain understandably angry and anxious. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how the Scottish Government's financial support will help to save jobs in Dundee, and can she assure staff that steps will be taken to fully remove the threat of compulsory redundancies?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I thank Mr Fitzpatrick for his question and also for his engagement as the local constituency MSP. It is quite simply, though, unacceptable that staff and students should suffer because of historic leadership and governance failures. The £40 million of funding that I have announced today for the next 2 academic years will give confidence to staff and students, and it will also help to return the university to the thriving institution that we all want it to be. This money, though, is needed to support that development and delivery of that sustainable long-term recovery plan that Mr Briggs quite rightly spoke to. And that will see, as I mentioned in my response to Mr Mara, public finance working alongside commercial and private investment to ultimately see that reliance on extraordinary public funding ending. But I will, of course, continue to consider all avenues and other support that might be needed in regard.
Maurice Golden, to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government providing £40 million to the University of Dundee is very welcome, subject to due diligence. Yet the liquidity gap remains between £45 million and £60 million across 2 academic years. Do these estimates factor in the expected recruitment challenges in both the domestic and international markets as a result of course reduction and reputational damage, and therefore could the Scottish Government offer any long-term assurance in terms of that liquidity gap beyond what the Cabinet Secretary has highlighted today?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Golden for his question. I think he hits on a really important point, and I welcome his welcoming of the £40 million announced today. There are issues in relation to the estimates that have been provided to ministers, and we will have to reassure ourselves of the totality of ask from the public purse in that regard. He quite rightly speaks to the impact of international immigration. Of course, this will be a factor in that regard. There will be fluctuating factors in the years to come that will impact on that totality. So we are working with the Scottish Funding Council to assure ourselves of that final figure. But we are also asking the university to look wider at other sources of funding, because there is not a sustainable future, I don't think any of us accept here, from the government directly providing ongoing funding on an ongoing basis. So we need to work with the university to allow them to come up with the plan that will be required to set out that sustainable future, which was the point Mr Briggs quite rightly made. So I agree with the points the member has raised today. We will continue to engage with the Scottish Funding Council on assuring ourselves absolutely of the totality of that liquidity ask.
Audrey Nicholl, to be followed by Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee provides a range of crucial forensic services in Scotland, and recent evidence provided to the Criminal Justice Committee's inquiry on drugs in prison described the drug testing service provided by the centre as critical. And I understand that 9 core-funded staff are at risk of redundancy, risking the future of the drug testing work for the Scottish Prison Service and the planned National Drug Testing Laboratory for Scotland. So can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on the work being done to secure the future of the centre, given its importance to the delivery of justice in Scotland? And can she provide some clarity around the University's recent statement that forensic science will continue to be delivered as part of its portfolio, while at the same time pressing ahead with a possible redundancy situation for all of its research active and core-funded forensic science staff?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Audrey Nicholl for raising a hugely important point. The contribution of Dundee to our national and our international forensics, justice and law enforcement policy is of significant importance, and the Government has made very strong representations to the University about the importance of retaining its strength and forensic sciences. The Justice Secretary, for some reassurance to Ms Nicholl, is a member of the cross-government group on Dundee, which is led by the Deputy First Minister, because we recognise the critical importance of the University's forensic science capabilities, and those capabilities must be protected into the future. And the Scottish Government and the Funding Council will continue to offer support to the University to ensure that it does fully explore all other available options to maintain that significant research expertise as part of their pathway to financial recovery. In terms of the situation at the Leverhulme Research Centre in particular, I understand that this relates to external research funding, which was already due to come to an end prior to the situation with Dundee's finances arising back in November. But I absolutely appreciate that this will be a really anxious time for staff, and I have asked that my officials engage with the Scottish Funding Council and other relevant stakeholders to explore options to optimise forensic capability at the University.
Pam Duncan-Glancy, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The report uncovers some awful failures, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to progress the wider governance lesson for the sector, and ask that she does so working with universities and the trade unions. But we shouldn't ignore that whilst Dundee has experienced unique problems, the sector is in dire straits, with many institutions having to make cuts, resulting in job losses and fewer students from deprived areas going to university. The entire sector has endured little more than managed decline on this government's watch, with year after year of cuts and being told there is no more money. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, can she tell us where is the £40 million coming from?
Cabinet Secretary.
That member for her question. Of course, our universities in Scotland do not exist in a silo. They are impacted by policies that exist across these islands, not least, of course, international immigration rules. And, of course, I'm sure the member will want to reflect on the role of that in relation to the findings from Pamela Gillies' report. Of course, Dundee University was also impacted by Brexit, and that is set out clearly in the report. And finally, I would make mention of the increase in national insurance contributions, which University Scotland estimate could cost the sector in Scotland alone up to £45 million. So I'm sure that Ms Duncan-Glancy will be urging her Labour colleagues to consider what more they could do to help alleviate the pressure on Scottish institutions and those across the United Kingdom. And of course, I will give her an undertaking that we will work with the trade unions and on a cross-party basis in relation to our continued work to support Dundee.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite claims made by Conservative and Labour members last week, Professor Gillies clearly outlines the impact of a number of policies implemented by both past and previous UK Tory and Labour governments, including restrictive immigration policies, national insurance rises and Brexit. So what is the Cabinet Secretary's assessment of how these Westminster policies have done further damage to the University of Dundee?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think, as I've just alluded to in my response to Ms Duncan-Glancy, the UK Government does have a role to play here, and it could help by recognising the impact of its policies that are damaging university finances, not just in Scotland but across the United Kingdom. I mentioned Brexit previously, national insurance rises and those immigration policies. all the responsibilities of another government. So it would be really welcome if we could have a team approach to supporting the sector in Scotland that recognised where other responsibilities rest. It doesn't need to be this way, and indeed the UK Government could of course support our plans for a Scottish graduate visa, or they could provide consequential support for universities for employer national insurance contributions. We are stepping up for universities in Scotland, and I would urge Labour members in particular to consider what more their Westminster colleagues could be doing too.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary highlights the Gillies report's call for openness and transparency, but already the interim leadership team is showing little sign of change. I've heard concerning reports that the democratically elected student rep on court is being asked by the interim chair to not attend handover court meetings that are discussing the report. There's been no attempt yet to include new voices from unions, DUSA or indeed the incoming rector in the development of the action plan due later this summer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that there is no justification for excluding court members from court discussions when there is no conflict of interest? And what more can the Government be doing to ensure the culture change needed starts now and discussions about the future are inclusive, open and transparent?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the member has set out a range of different factors that I'm not familiar with, but I think the important point to take from my statement today is that we all come together to work to support a viable future for the university. I do not think it would be appropriate for me to comment on the specific minutiae that the member has set out today in relation to the role of court. What I would say is that I understand the Deputy Chair of Court was appointed by the Court of Dundee University by correspondence on the 16th of June last week. The appointment was for the Court and was made by the Court. Professor Seaton was the university's choice of interim principal, and any dialogue, of course, with the Scottish Funding Council in that space was about process to ensure that they were following their governance processes, which I think is the essence of the question I have been asked. But my understanding and that of the SFC is that processes have been followed as appropriate, but I'm more than happy to engage with the member and the trade unions on the substantives of her point today.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
I'll have the opportunity later on this week to question the former leadership of Dundee University, but I'm concerned today about its future because it's far from certain. The money available, that's good. I'm really pleased about the £40 million, but it is only for 2 years. And to avoid future job losses, on top of the 300 that are already going, there will need to be a significant increase in growth of income. Significant. And if that doesn't happen, more job losses could come. And people don't believe that it's realistic that we're going to have a significant increase in growth in such a short period of time. So if we're back here again, will the Government step in again to avoid future job losses?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Rennie for his question and also for his participation in the roundtables we've held with local members, and he's welcomed again the £40 million of funding today. I do not want to be back here in 2 years' time talking about additionality to the sector and in particular to Dundee University. The purpose of our announcing this funding today is unique, it is unprecedented, and that is why of course ministers have been advised to use a Section 25, which is very, very different from the approach that we actually took earlier in the year, if Mr Rennie recalls, in relation to the wider funding that was announced for the sector, of which Dundee received £22 million in funding and support. I think this goes back to the essence of Mr Briggs' question at the start of the questions, Presiding Officer, which was about that plan, that sustainable look to the future. The leadership of Dundee University have to come forward with that plan at pace. The Scottish Funding Council have been working to support them in that regard. And of course that plan will require to look at extra sources of funding that are not public money, because that is not a sustainable way in which to fund our autonomous, independent universities. So we will continue to work with the university sector. We provided that £40 million of support thus far, in addition to the £22 million worth of support. We will continue to work with the university on the liquidity ask to that end, and of course on leveraging in that wider investment, which will be critical to the points that Mr Rennie has made in relation to growth.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite financial challenges and declining international student numbers, it seems the university senior management hired more staff and continued to spend money without control. Professor Gillis' review points to a failure of leadership. Leaders of the university's court and members of senior management, including former Scottish Labour leader Wendy Alexander, now a Labour peer in the House of Lords, have let down Dundee's staff and students. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the university requires fresh, strong leadership going forward? And could she reiterate how the Scottish Funding Council is working with Dundee to support them?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I fully agree with the sentiment behind Ms Mackay's question. I do understand there's a need for that interim leadership, as members will well understand, but that long-term plan that I spoke to in response to Mr Rennie has to be put in place as soon as possible. So I do very much welcome the appointment of Professor Nigel Seaton as interim principal and Ian Mayer as the interim chair of court before elections run for that permanent chair over the summer. And whilst the leadership is ultimately a matter for the university, I would reflect that whatever process is used to address the leadership gap should look to both appoint effective leaders and to restore confidence in the court and the executive team. The Scottish Funding Council, though, has been supporting the university, including through convening support from leaders elsewhere in the university sector.
Douglas Ross, to be followed by Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Gillies report sets out a timeline and a series of decisions that reek of incompetence and corruption. Now, having listened to the Cabinet Secretary's earlier response, she does not believe through the Gillies report that the level of criminality has yet been breached. If further information does come forward or that subjective view alters, can she confirm that the Scottish Government will fully cooperate with any criminal investigation surrounding Dundee University and the people in charge of it? And in response to an earlier question, the Cabinet Secretary said the court elected the interim chair on the 16th of June. The 16th of June was last Monday, several days before the Gillies report was published, and we were all told that immediately after that report, the chair of the court resigned. So did the Cabinet Secretary misspeak when she said the 16th of June, or were people resigning from the court and the top of Dundee University before this report was even published?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Ross for his question on that final point. I've clearly got the date inadvertently wrong in my speaking note here, so I will seek to correct the record at a later date. In relation to the kind of thrust of his question, I agree with Mr Ross in relation to the damning verdict of the report, and he talks through the timeline. And on reading the report last week, I was struck throughout the report at the various different places at which intervention could and should have been taken, and the lack of opportunity to do so, of course, has led us to where we are today. He mentions alleged criminality. I think this was mentioned by Mr Briggs as well. Of course, I've already sought assurances from the Scottish Funding Council on that matter and from Professor Pamela Gillies. They were both clear there was no evidence of criminality to that end, and I wanted to assure myself of that point. But, of course, the Government would cooperate with any inquiry in that regard.
Thank you. I'm keen to include all members who have pressed, so concise questions and responses appreciated. I call Colette Stevenson to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Though ultimately not responsible for governance at Dundee University, the Scottish Government should still be encouraging all employers and institutions to follow the Fair Work principles of good engagement with employees and trade unions to bring everyone to the table. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on the latest Scottish Government engagement with employees of Dundee University and trade unions to ensure their voices inform the Scottish Government's work going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I mentioned, I think previously, Presiding Officer, the Minister for Higher Education and I have met with trade unions a number of times, and Mr Day met with Campins Unions last Thursday following publication of the review. We continue to have a really useful dialogue with them, and we've been supporting that relationship building with the executive team additionally. I would also draw members' attention to the work of the task force, which has been chaired by Sir Alan Langland, in ensuring that voices are being heard. The task force has now met 3 times, bringing together a wider range of key stakeholders, including trade unions, Dundee City Council, other universities, enterprise and skills bodies, the NHS, businesses and student representatives.
Smith, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you. Given all that's happened, Cabinet Secretary, do you consider that there will be a case made to review the Higher Education Governance Scotland Act of 2016, about which this Parliament deliberated very long and hard?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Ms Smith for that question. It was a topic of discussion. I hear the First Minister chuckling at Cabinet this morning, the historic passage of that legislation at the time. I have not had that case presented to me thus far. I did discuss this at length with the Chair of the SFC yesterday with Mr Day, and we also discussed it with the SFC last week in relation to governance changes. Her view, and that of Pamela Gillies, I should say, is that there is enough guidance in place. However, I am also aware from our engagement with the Chair of the SFC, there is wider work across the UK at the current time to look at the strengthening of governance in institutions, and I have committed that we will engage with the SFC to that end.
And John Mason.
Thank you. Both the internal and external auditors appear to have given the University a clean bill of health for July 23 accounts, which would not have been completed till about the end of 2023. Does that surprise the Cabinet Secretary that the auditors don't seem to have picked anything up?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Mason for his question in that regard. I've read in the press some of the commentary from the auditors. I am advised that the activity to the time and the cost for the audit process around about the audit itself is being undertaken at the current time. But I do understand the University are meeting with auditors today in that regard, if that gives Mr Mason some comfort. Ernst & Young have also stated that they're unable to give an audit opinion without knowing the outcome of the investigations, as I think Mr Mason has alluded to which the University has been subject. So given that the University and the auditors are meeting today, I will await the outcome of that meeting and, of course, further advice from the SFC.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement on the initial response to the Gillish Review. I'll allow a brief moment for front benches to reorganise before the next item.